Good afternoon, and welcome to this senior level session on humanitarian civil-military coordination as an enabler of international humanitarian law. Not the catchiest of titles, but we know why we're here. Okay? My name is Ikenna Azuike, and it is my pleasure to be your host for this session. As you're all probably already aware, I certainly hope so if you're sitting here, today's session centers around the importance of upholding international humanitarian law, and specifically the role that civil-military coordination can play in doing that upholding. I'm sure a lot of the other speakers have already mentioned this session couldn't be more timely. You know, if you look at your smartphones, the front pages of newspapers, incredibly urgent what we're going to discuss today. So bearing in mind how we don't get much opportunity to come together like this, I'd like to encourage everyone to be very concrete in your contributions. That's what our guests are certainly going to do. Everyone watching at home, everyone here in the audience, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions via Slido. Make them solutions-focused, as constructive as possible, and then we can really make some headway. I know your time is precious, so let me outline the three focus areas of the session today. First of all, how civil-military coordination can contribute further to ensuring respect and compliance with international humanitarian law. How could civil-military coordination improve its effectiveness in the context of the common security and defense policy? And what opportunities and challenges does the European Peace Facility and the upcoming human rights due diligence framework provide? And what lessons can the European Union use from other international actors and partners, and how could coordination with them in this area be further improved? Okay, lots of relevant speakers, not to mention our first two keynote speakers who are sitting next to me on this very roomy stage that we have over here. I have the head of division for integrated approach, methodology, and implementation at the European External Action Service, Mr. Brice de Schieter, and the director of operations at the EU military staff, Brigadier General Bart Laurent. They will each be giving a keynote talk to start with. They'll be staying with us throughout the session. Later on, we'll have a panel discussion, and there's going to be lots of conversation also with all of you. Okay, so, Mr. de Schieter, the floor is yours, or the lectern.
Thank you very much, Ikenna, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I say it's my first public event in more than 2 years in the COVID circumstances, so it feels a bit refreshing, renewed, and somehow slightly intimidating to be speaking in front of you, especially as we have a very serious subject. And unfortunately, as you reminded us, Ikenna, we have to start with a start note, mentioning the unprecedented humanitarian disaster provoked by Russian military aggression in Ukraine, which reminds us also once again the crucial importance of humanitarian civil-military coordination and the respect for international humanitarian law. And even in terms of war, these are rules that must be respected and upheld. Yet we should make no mistake that these terrible events also stem from what appears in this case to be a deliberate ignorance of those principles, and we have seen, alas, also in other theaters such as Syria. For value-based actors such as the EU, compliance with human rights and international humanitarian law is a core principle of crisis response, and it's integrated in the design and implementation of all of our tools. So this leads to our discussion today to reflect how an effective humanitarian civil-military coordination can be an important enabler for the respect of international humanitarian law. The first point I want to raise is that as the EU, we want to make sure that the dialogue and also the enhanced interaction between humanitarian, civilian and military actors takes place. That's a starting point which is necessary for safeguarding humanitarian principles, for facilitating protection outcomes, and also ensuring that all actors know the mandates, roles, and the nature of each other's work. In other words, it's a dialogue and cooperation which is vital as we want to have a good implementation of the do no harm principle. Second observation here is that the EU has different instruments and tools to promote human rights and international humanitarian law, the protection of civilians, women and children, and it's important, from our perspective, to make concerted efforts to integrate protection aspects within our security and defense initiatives. This is why the EU developed several policies and guidelines, including guidelines on promoting the compliance with international humanitarian law already in 2009, which includes crisis management operations and training among the means of action at the disposal of the EU to promote the respect for international humanitarian law. Here are a few concrete examples. The EU military training missions in Mali, in Somalia, Central African Republic, also Mozambique today, include modules on international humanitarian law as part of the training delivered to national armed forces. In addition, some civilian missions are also involved in very specific activities that are related to international humanitarian law, such as the EULEX Kosovo, which contributes through its forensic expert capacity to, for example, the identification of missing persons, and continues also a monitoring of war crime cases. UMM Georgia also can be an example, as it has a mandate to monitor and report on violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Another concrete example, also highlighting the importance of partnership, could be mentioned in relation to G5 Sahel, as the EU is implementing jointly with the OHCHR, I'm very pleased to see Anthony here with us, the Human Rights Compliance Framework for the G5 Sahel forces since 2018, and also more recently for the African Union. And those are projects that help the partner forces receiving EU funds to also build the internal capabilities to prevent and respond to potential human rights violations. Fourth point I wanted to mention is that we remain vigilant also when developing new instruments in the EU's peace and security toolbox. And I will take here the example of the European Peace Facility. This instrument, that many of you must be familiar with, enables the EU to finance assistance measures that are aimed to strengthening the capacity of third states and regional and international organizations, potentially, relating to military and defense matters. And that also brings, of course, additional challenges. There are risks that are associated with this type of support, and for this reason, elements of compliance, proportionality, protection, and also controls after delivery are clearly factored into all the assistance measures that are planned under the EPF. So, for example, an infringement of commitments by a partner may lead to the suspension or termination of the assistance measure in question. Besides our existing work on integrating and promoting international humanitarian law, the EU is also engaged in improving our human rights and international humanitarian law risk management practices. And I want here to highlight some of the avenues that we are looking at and that one can take. First, we have a reflection now starting on the notion of human rights due diligence policy on security sector support, as foreseen in the EU Action Plan for Human Rights and Democracy. We're not there yet, but the idea here is to have a more systematic and consistent approach to risk management across our different tools and instruments. And an efficient risk management, of course, will also enable to further minimize negative humanitarian consequences and reduce risks to civilians. A second avenue, and I already alluded, I think at some point, to cooperation with international organizations, and more specifically with the UN. And here the EU and the UN have a formalized strategic partnership on peace operations and crisis management that has been in place already since 2018, and with the recognition of the promotion of human rights and international humanitarian law as cross-cutting priority. It's a common value, and it's also, of course, an instrument for sustainable conflict management. Third element in terms of future avenues from a capacity development angle, we're also committed to improving our internal civilian-military coordination mechanisms. And there's already a functioning and institutionalized civilian-military coordination and cooperation, both in theaters, of course, coordination between EU delegations and the deployed CSDP missions and operations, as well as in Brussels through what we call the Joint Support Coordination Cell. Another factor here to highlight is that training is key for the capability development, and recently training requirement analysis was conducted, which actually recommended that all generic CSDP, basic and pre-deployment trainings should now highlight linkages between humanitarian and CSDP missions mandates, and we are following up on that element. Finally, I would like also to bring this into the overall context by reminding that our different activities are also part of the EU's integrated approach to external conflicts and crises, which aims to have a better coordinated and a more holistic approach to conflict and crisis management. In practice, what this means is that political, diplomatic, but also development assistance, humanitarian, peace and security related tools and instruments are not just implemented side by side in one specific context, but that we look at the coherence of the timing and the scope of those interventions. The work that we are doing right now in Mozambique, for example, is a clear example of the efforts of an integrated approach. And the effective civilian-military cooperation, the promotion of international humanitarian law are, of course, very strong parts of the integrated approach. We need to take later the same integrated approach when we'll be looking at Ukraine, and we already are starting now, when diplomatic, political, crisis response, humanitarian, civil protection mechanisms are to be mobilized, and in order to respond also holistically to the humanitarian disaster and prepare also for the future and what will come up when, let's hope, this crisis will be over. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I say let's just swap straight ahead. Yeah, go for it. Let me just grab my notes. Thanks very much.
Want your phone back?
No, I'm going to leave it there. I'll be checking if it's still there, okay?
Then I will keep it. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm Bart Laurent, Director of Operations of the EU Military Staff, as introduced. And it is truly a privilege and an honor to have this opportunity today to talk to you. And it will not be a surprise that what I will say, and although we did not coordinate it civil-military in advance, I will not contradict what Brice just said. On the contrary, I will be complimentary to what he says, or what he just said, and be as practical or pragmatic as possible, highlighting how we see the importance of the respect of IHL and human rights in our military CSDP missions. As well known, IHL seeks to limit the devastating effects of armed conflict, but although its principles are universally recognized and accepted as means to mitigate harm to human lives and safeguard dignity, unfortunately, as very recent examples again show, but not only in Ukraine, the same happened in Syria as well, for example, unfortunately the compliance with those principles is not always universally guaranteed. Compliance with IHL is an indispensable prerequisite for limiting the negative consequences on people affected by armed conflicts. The EU is strongly committed in the promotion of it, and the principles of promoting human dignity and adherence to the principles of international law are emphasized in its founding treaty. that should not be a surprise. Moreover, throughout the years, this commitment has also been reaffirmed in various EU official documents and policies such as the EU Global Strategy from 2016 and the EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, as Brice has just said. Another important milestone is the Council conclusion from 2019 on humanitarian assistance and international humanitarian law. It embraces the responsibilities of different EU institutions and bodies, the Council, the High Representative, supported by the European External Action Service, the EU Special Representative for Human Rights, European Commission, as well as its member states. It involves the exercise of EU's powers across different policy areas, notably the Common Foreign Security Policy, in which is englobed the Common Security and Defence Policy, CSDP, development cooperation and humanitarian aid. Currently, all CSDP military missions explicitly include IHL as part of their mandates and emphasize the promotion of IHL compliance. The EU training missions promote the obligations under international laws, namely the International Humanitarian Rights Law and IHL, in their training and education activities. Training and mentoring provided also include the prevention of and the protection against sexual and gender-based violence, and in addition, IHL considerations are included in the advice activities provided to host nations' authorities on defense policy. The IHL training modules offered by the EU training missions to the host nations' armed forces demonstrate in a very pragmatic way the importance and relevance of the EU integrated approach. Keeping IHL as a high priority in the agenda and convening it since the early stages, including during the CSDP planning, that's a nice music, as well as to higher political and military strategic levels of the national authorities concerned, is key. Similarly, ensuring the integration of IHL at the operational and tactical levels on a very practical way and close coordination and support with our international partners in theatre is vital. Now, looking more in depth to the respective training missions, EUTM Mali in 2017, and by coincidence I know it very well because we were both very closely involved in that endeavor, we constructed with our mission a whole series of videos to be used by the Malian armed forces with, I think, 6 or 7 really specific scenarios that they would recognize based on local habits with local actors, in fact, but all focused on how do I react as a soldier in this case. And I do know that these videos are still used up to today, which I can quote as a success. So EUTM Mali has been focusing on giving the Malian armed forces the knowledge regarding law of armed conflict and the principles of international humanitarian law, such as distinction, proportionality, precaution, and military necessity. The training format is not only classroom-based. The proof is the videos, but it is permanently implemented by conducting scenario-based exercises and training exercises with their troops. For the Central African Republic, in which we also have a military training mission, the educational activities put the emphasis on reconciliation between the population and the armed groups, and the armed forces, mainly through classes on IHL, prevention of sexual violence, leadership and ethics, human rights, international law, protection of civilians, children in armed conflicts, gender equity, and WPS, Women, Peace and Security, are integral part of the training provided to troops and senior ranks. To facilitate integration and training on these issues, EUTM in the Central African Republic has a long-standing cooperation with various international organizations such as the ICRC and the United Nations, which was, by the way, also the case in Mali, of course. And these organizations with whom we cooperate very closely provide the in the field training, both to ourselves, but also to the host nation trainees. In Somalia, the EUTM provides IHL and women and child protection in armed conflict modules in its courses, delivered to the Somalian National Armed Forces. In the past years, courses and training were also supported by the United Nations and the ICRC as well. EUTM Somalia also conducts train-the-trainer courses in these fields in order to boost the Somali-owned training system. In Mozambique, and Brice gave a couple of examples of Mozambique also, the EUTM focuses on providing training to selected companies of the Mozambican armed forces to form a quick reaction force to be able to become active in the Cabo Delgado province, which is the province with the problems in the north of the country. Human rights, IHL, women and child protection are cemented as dedicated modules in the overall training program. Human rights and IHL lessons are prepared and given jointly by mission trainers and ICRC instructors. It's important to note that the proper conduct of the Mozambican forces in Cabo Delgado, including compliance to human rights and IHL standards, is a prerequisite not only for the continuation of the training mission, but also for the provision of equipment through the EPF, the European Peace Facility Assistance Measures Program, which is substantial. And last but not least, EUTM Mozambique hosts several seminars covering topics such as human rights and IHL, women, peace and security, etc. We have to consider, however, that these training missions, by their mandate and construct, are non-executive missions, and deployed EU military personnel are therefore limited and constrained by the mandates. Although during the training and courses our instructors are passing the required knowledge and tools to comply with IHL and human rights principles, we are unfortunately very limited in monitoring the operations they conduct when they are deployed in operational engagements. And this is not only true for IHL and human rights, it is in fact true for the whole gamma of capacities. That void, we try to close it, or to fill it through a knowledge management cycle, but we have to remain realistic with ourselves and not lie. And acknowledge that there is still work to be done, but as long as the mandates remain non-executive, it will be very complicated to join them during the operations. To mitigate this risk, and in line with the EU Action Plan for Democracy and Human Rights from 20 to 24, the EU has created the working group intended to provide recommendations on EU human rights due diligence policy, also mentioned by Brice. This group has been working on the EU HRDDP for the past year, and I am assuming that quite a lot of you have been contributing to this work and are still providing support to that development. To conclude, civil-military coordination and cooperation are crucial aspects of our approach. The partnership between DG ECHO and the EU military staff in advancing the civil-military dialogue around IHL is well-founded. The EU concept on effective civil coordination in support of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, approved by the EU Military Committee, clearly identifies the relevance of coordination with various civil actors in theatre. From a personal point of view, I do know that all bodies deployed in theatre do cooperate very well. International organizations such as the ICRC and the United Nations are strategic humanitarian partners for the EU. They are present in many difficult contexts, including all theatres where the EU military missions operate under the CSDP umbrella. These civilian organizations and their personnel are in continuous communication with local population of the host nations, with us as well, of course, And through the coordination between the various EU actors under the coordination umbrella, let's say, of the EU delegation and our partners, including those involved in humanitarian development and peace and security, we believe we are not only complementing our respective roles and goals, but also further alleviating the suffering of the most vulnerable and showing our solidarity with the local populations. Thank you very much for having me, for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Thanks.
Yeah, fantastic. I feel like that was a great foundation to build from. You know, the kind of big picture view of what's going on at EU level, and Brigadier General, the way that you painted a picture for us as to what is literally happening on the ground. Just before I introduce the panel, I do have one follow-up question for you, Brigadier General. One thing that strikes me is, I question as somewhat of an outsider to this, what use is the coordination if you're not able to, you mentioned that it's a non-executive role that you have, if you can't take that extra step and monitor?
Like this?
Yeah, go for it.
It works. Well, I am a soldier, and I do acknowledge a certain level of frustration in not being able...
I think we heard that, yeah.
in not being able to follow those who we trained. If I compare my NATO engagement in Afghanistan, we did follow the Afghans that we trained while being in combat, which is not entirely the guarantee that they will be or remain compliant to all rules that we have explained them. In the non-executive missions, we cannot do it ourselves. However, if I take the example of Mali, and in my period, we had at least 2 complementary missions that were also deployed in Mali, which is MINUSMA, the United Nations mission, and the French operation Barkhane. And being complementary, we had a certain level of feedback on how the Malian armed forces were conducting their operations and how they were compliant. Now, we all know that Barkhane is in a phase of reviewing its posture, and we also know that some other friends from more in the eastern part of Europe are present, and we don't really like them anymore, especially not after what they did since the 24th of February. So yes, I do have a concern on the follow-up of knowing and closing, in fact, the acknowledgement cycle. Same in Cabo Delgado. The Mozambican armed forces do not have a tradition of being compliant with IHL and human rights. However, we do count on third parties, and that can be NGOs, that can be personnel from the delegation, etc.
Great.
And
well, hopefully we can pick up on that later, and maybe also discuss how we elevate this from non-executive to executive. I don't know exactly how it works, but working with other partner organizations sounds also sensible. Okay, let us push on with our panel discussion. I'm going to invite each of our panelists to come on stage. First of all, the Chief of UN OCHA Civil Military Coordination Service, Mr. Bediako Buahene. Mr. Bediako, let's give a little round of applause, people. The Director of International Law and Policy at ICRC, Dr. Helen Durham. The Chief of Peace Mission Support Section at UN OHCHR, Mr. Anthony Cardon de Lichtboer. And the Europe Director at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, Civic, Ms. Beatrice Godefroy. Welcome. Okay, let me jump straight in. Mr. Buahene, OCHA. What is OCHA's approach with respect to promoting the respect of and compliance with international humanitarian law?
Thanks, and thanks very much to be here. I'm very pleased for that. Maybe I can start with a correction, and that is, as OCHA, and as the Civil Military Coordination Service, we don't do compliance. That is not our role. In other words, compliance in our view, implies a monitoring function and an ability to do something if there is a violation. That is not OCHA's role. That is not the Humanitarian Civil Military Coordination's role.
I'm very curious to hear whose role it is, because someone needs
I
to
leave it
monitor.
to others. It's certainly member states immediately come to mind.
Okay.
If no one else, but and I'm happy to expand on that later, perhaps. So what we do as the Civil Military Coordination Service in OCHA, and maybe I can take a step back on that, it is Civil Military Coordination is part of the overall access mandate that OCHA has, and the access mandate that OCHA has came out of a General Assembly resolution where the Undersecretary General and the Emergency Relief Coordinator has been tasked by the General Assembly resolution to facilitate humanitarian access. And part of humanitarian access in certain environments is civil military coordination, and that's where we come into that. And how we then deal with IHL or protection issues, it's not the standard way that you would have a protection agency or a protection organization or protection NGOs work, but rather we do it through a facilitation. We coordinate the various actors on the ground. So we are the interface between the humanitarian world and the military world within the international system. And we, through dialogue and through training, raise awareness on IHL. We raise awareness on protection issues, sexual exploitation, gender-based violence, are issues that are always front and center on in any of our trainings. IHL is center on our trainings. So we have two. Let me just give you two.
And literally,
key
who are you
examples.
training?
Sorry?
Who are you training?
I'm getting at that.
Okay.
At this very second. So what we do, unlike others, we actually train humanitarians, the military, and civil authorities. Depending on context, some of the civil authorities are actually in charge of military actors. And what we also do is we deal with armed groups as well. We don't just deal with the regular military. So far, we have not had regular military, armed groups, and humanitarians all in the same room, but we do train the various groups. So in the same room, we would have the military actors, humanitarian actors, potentially civil actors, and United Nations. And that fosters a community, because the one thing that is actually missing by going only bilateral is a common understanding as to what we do and who we are as a community. So we had a training, for example, in Dakar last year. It was our first training, actually, in person that we were able to do post the pandemic. Well, I guess the pandemic's still on, post the height of the pandemic. And what was very interesting in that Dakar training was that you had the humanitarian community and the military community in the same room. They know of each other, but they were never really together before. They never really understood each other's mandates. And as trite or as simple as that sounds, it's actually a very important benchmark. It's a very important step to take to say, listen, this is what we do as a humanitarian. We have the humanitarian principles. This may be contrary to your belief as to why we're on the ground. From a military perspective, a very, very classic example is, why are you feeding the people we're killing? Why are you feeding the soldiers we're shooting? That is a standard military question that is often not answered, but in those sort of fora. Mm-hmm. So that's why these training sessions that we do, they're usually 5 days long if they're residential and 6 weeks if they're online, are very important to foster a benchline understanding. Okay. And then in those, we do IHL, we do protection, child protection. It's all part of the training.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to you, Anthony. What is the OHCHR, the UN's approach to IHL?
Yeah,
much the same.
Sorry for.
You're going to disappoint me, aren't you? You're not monitoring.
Sorry for OHCHR, my friend. Yeah, this is something I'm not responsible of. But we're trying to change, by the way. I'm going to give you the example of what we've been trying to do concretely with the G5 style force.
Yeah. Please do.
And I think basically three things that we believe, and again I insist on that. We are not pretending that we have always the right answers, but we've tried very much. The first is to try to go. For many years, decades, we've done at UN OHCHR, we've done a lot of monitoring and reporting of human rights violations, but try to go beyond the violations, trying to go beyond just naming and shaming security forces for what they do, but try to, better understand why they do that and what is it that we can do in terms of providing technical cooperations to these forces. And that was not an easy exercise. And I want to emphasize the fact that obviously monitoring and reporting is extremely important, but the idea of going beyond, we believe, was also important because we haven't seen a lot of changes, that, at least from our perspective, after decades of these public reports on violation. The second thing has been to try to convey the message that compliance with human rights and IHL is an operational necessity rather than principles that are potentially perceived to be imposed by Western countries. But, and particularly when we talk about the G5 Sahel, we talk about counter-terrorism operations. If you kill civilians or if you do damage to civilians, it's going to be counterproductive. And on the contrary, it might even sort of worsen the situation, and you may provoke civilians to join extremist violent groups. So that's the second aspect of it. And then the third is both trying to and understand what I'm trying to say. I mean, certainly with regard to the general, we've gone towards the sort of more executive, from our point of view, a more executive manner. Try to be useful in terms of what we offer, not make trainings on international conventions of human rights that, a lot of the military do not either understand or do not care about, but try to really produce tools that can be useful and to provide and to go beyond training. If you hear the diplomats and you talk to the diplomats, very usually the answer is, well, we should provide more training to security forces, and then hopefully it should be better. No, it's not enough. Training is absolutely essential, but we need to go beyond that, and we need to look at other mechanisms that...
Can you give an example, concrete examples of
selection and screening before these people are deployed in operations, who are participating. We're looking obviously at the planning of military operations, after action reviews, very important to sort of get lessons learned about why violations have been committed, and also working on accountability measures. And that's specifically the idea of before we make these big calls about jurisdiction, prosecuting soldiers for violations, what is it that the military can do immediately? Like, for example, and we've seen that recently, joint operations, for example, result in incidents with civilians, and the response in, for example, a press release by the force is going to be, well, it's not us, or even blaming civilians, rather than, taking a more an approach that is recognizing the problem and sort of emphasizing that, which is way better in terms of building the trust of civilian population.
Yeah, that's very clear. Thank you. I particularly like the idea of pointing out that it's an operational necessity. I can imagine that really kind of elevates the importance of compliance among local partners. Before I go to Dr. Durham, though, can you share very, very briefly a couple of concrete insights with respect to understanding why it happens, that kind of why the infringements happen, why international humanitarian law? You said that was sort of the first pillar. It's monitoring plus.
Well, I mean, why? I mean, it's always tricky to say why violations are happening. But yes, you are trying to understand, because for us, what I was saying is that we have for many years and we are trying to do that relatively well, monitor, try to collect information about these incidents, and try to call. And this is, by the way, what the international community is expecting from us, to report about these violations, but try to better understand why they've been committed, and try to find more concrete and adequate responses to that. And that is, for example, by tailoring the measures. If you talk to armies in the Sahel, they're very keen to say, well, can you try to adapt your framework to our operational context and the way we operate, and we've been trying to do that on a certain extent.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Durham, ICRC's approach with respect as an enabler of international humanitarian law, can you paint a picture for us? Is it working? I don't know. Is it working?
Great, let's go. Listen, thank you very much for that question, and I think I just wanted to take a step back for a moment and say, why do we want compliance with IHL? When we have compliance with IHL, we see that those no longer directly participating in hostilities are not attacked. We see people not disappeared. It's not on.
Let's use this mic. Try this one.
Great, thank you. Merci. So let's just take a step back for a moment to understand why are we talking about this today. I think we all have acknowledged that it's tragically relevant to this region of the world, but from Yemen to Afghanistan to Ethiopia to Syria to the Chad Lake region, it's a pressing humanitarian issue. And why do we want compliance with IHL? It means that civilians and those not taking part in hostilities are protected. It means that essential infrastructure, hospitals, schools, water sanitation, those elements that keep communities alive are not attacked. It means that people can trace family members when they flee for their lives. I think it's really, really important to locate the human agency in this issue as a starting point. Now, as an organisation that for 150 years are the guardians and the promoters of international humanitarian law, we've actively played many, many roles in ensuring it's not only educating those who use it, but also the wider community. This is a legal framework that in over 436 articles says what unites us is more profound than what divides us. So we need to have a technical element, which we do in ICRC, where it's about implementing legislation, making sure that states have the capacity to do what they've signed up to with the universal ratification of the Geneva Conventions. We do a lot of training. I think last year it was over 50,000 of military officers. We do a lot of training with non-state armed groups, but we have to find different ways of doing it. We have to find ways that make traction with these normative frameworks, with their own experiences, their own culture. So increasingly we work with Islamic scholars to make sure that we don't come at it, the Geneva Conventions, I get told when I've been in the field many times, Geneva's far away, it's chocolate, it's cuckoo clocks, it's calm. How is it relevant to what we're experiencing here? So we have to take these fundamental IHL principles and make sure they have connections with those we're trying to influence. And there is a massive work we've done in that space, and a really interesting report called Roots of Restraint that looks at why is it and how is it that you change the behaviour of belligerents or those involved in conflict. So I wanted to start through that entry point. A lot of the interesting work I see we're also doing is, and thank you, Sarah, for mentioning the video clip, we're doing a lot of work with virtual reality to make sure that you take these principles out of the classroom and allow, whether it be the military or diplomats or decision makers, to strap on goggles, to use things in their hands, to actually experience what it means around targeting, around proportionality, around these key principles. The other thing I wanted to flag is that increasingly, and I think this is very relevant today, right here, the ICRC is engaging with EU members and others that aren't perhaps got the footprints on the ground, may not be reaching the threshold of a party to a conflict, but are supporting, are transferring weapons, are doing training, are engaging, and the capacity for those states to have an influence on the behaviour. So in many ways they're facilitating, but they're not at the threshold themselves. So I think there's many other things to say. I was really delighted to hear about the two key speakers mentioning Mozambique. I know ICRC was deeply involved in that. Also with the training in Burkina Faso, in CAR, in Mali. And I think ensuring that the mission itself has the development of command and control structures and mechanisms is really important. So we need to be rigorous on the law, we need to understand the political environment, and we need to be creative in finding ways for making this happen on the ground. And I think we've got lots of experiences along the panel here and out there, I'm sure, in the audience. But if we don't combine all these elements, I don't think we're living up to our humanitarian principles.
Okay, so thank you very much. Very clear there. I'm interested in hearing what some of the challenges are. Beatrice, you and I spoke a little bit briefly earlier, you discussed the fact that you could speak to the challenges when it comes to civil and military coordination, specifically to disinformation, military contractors, and urban warfare. Can you elaborate?
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much for the...
Is that working? I don't think it's... Try one of the other two. Or turn it on. Does that one work?
Yeah? Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to be speaking also here from the perspective of civil society, from a civil society organization that actually does civil-military engagement in a number of contexts. And I'm here on this stage with a lot of partners and colleagues with whom we are doing work jointly on the ground or collaboration on the ground. And just maybe before coming to these challenges, following up on some of the points that were mentioned, from our perspective, it's absolutely essential indeed to do civil and military engagement, so meaning engagement between civil society and the military, but also between communities and the military, and to factor in these engagements and the results of this dialogue at each of the different levels, meaning foreign policy orientations, meaning operational, strategic level, tactical level guidance for the military, meaning instruments and responses to crisis. And there was a lot of mention of a comprehensive approach, and we know that this word for our humanitarian community is a sensitive one. It's loaded, so to say. But there is indeed a need to create these interactions in order to integrate the protection of civilians, integrate the implementation of IHL, put it really at the center of our equation when we respond to a crisis and when we look at implementation of IHL. So to come to your point on the challenges, I wanted to maybe highlight. I think especially all of us are having in mind what's happening in Ukraine today, and a lot is unfolding in front of our eyes. The first one, when it comes to let's say new trends in warfare that civilians are facing, and therefore challenges to civil-military engagement. The first one I would like to mention is urban warfare and the impact of large-scale combat operations on civilians. There was a dedicated panel on that today, so I won't come back to it. But I think what's particularly challenging in what we're seeing unfolding in Ukraine today is the ways when let's say an enemy, an armed force, is using specific tactics, techniques, and procedures which are designed in a way to cause massive civilian casualties. It's challenged very much the way we look at, of course, IHL implementation, but of course, civil-military engagement as well. And this is an incredibly difficult challenge when it comes to establishing safe channels of communications around very critical processes such as evacuations and humanitarian access. But also it means that the primary responders and the primary level of civil-military engagement is happening at the very tactical or local level between local responders, military or civilians, and the communities themselves. So a context like this one calls us to think creatively and innovatively as to how can we better support these localized efforts through in addition to our higher levels SIMCORD channels, which are, I'm very impressed actually by the work that your agencies are doing, ICRC, OCHA, SIMCORD. That's an extremely challenging context to be doing this work today. Second challenge I wanted to...
Before you go to the second challenge, so what sort of specific support can you give those local first responders, for instance?
Well, so it means that concretely you need to get to the granular level of how are the communities assessing their own protection needs, protection gaps, what are the self-protection measures they are putting in place, and how can you best support the local responders in responding to these challenges. So it may mean specifically in areas where we don't have access, how can you support remotely? Mm-hmm. And it may mean in area where you have a risk of escalation, looking more at how can you support the preparedness for potential rising risks.
Okay.
Again, it's a very humbling conversation. I think all of us are trying to think creatively of this at the moment. Mm-hmm. So a second... you're the time keeper,
yeah,
so
you're gonna have
being mindful of time.
Yeah.
Second challenge I wanted to emphasize is, in the context of Ukraine again, is disinformation warfare and hybrid tactics and how it impacts the protection of civilians. At Civic, we had produced last year a report on hybrid warfare and the protection of civilians in Ukraine, but it was in the context of low-intensity warfighting. And we were looking at how the main impact that we were seeing were actually psychological harm. Today, we see how disinformation tactics do have impact at the physical level, on the physical, let's say, physical security and safety of the people. For instance, fake news being used in the context of evacuations, for instance, mean that people may not have the information that they need to have in terms of making their own decision for where they need to go, what they need to do to save their own lives. And so coming to the challenge in terms of civil-military coordination or civil-military engagement, it means how can we support the efforts of local responders and communities, again, in terms of having access to, let's say, verified or more reliable information so that they can make their own decisions in a safer way. And just getting quickly to the third challenge I wanted to mention, moving away for now from Ukraine, the question of private military contractors. And we were discussing this with others today in this forum. Having private actors, and especially private actors contracted by a variety of states or territorial or home states, does create challenges for civil military engagement. It creates enormous threats to civilians when those private military contractors operate, let's say, with a different consideration of civilian protection. But it does create also challenges for monitoring agencies. And the UN, OHCHR, and monitoring agencies are doing a fantastic role to try and capture harm that's created by those contractors, but it's a very dangerous role.
Is it harder to get private contractors to respect international humanitarian law? Is it as simple as that?
Yeah, how to respond to this question shortly? It's actually so you have different types of you have different types of, let's say, those. If we're speaking, for instance, of the Wagners, of this type of private military contractors, it's extremely hard to establish the chains of responsibilities and accountability. And then, yes, what we have observed through our research is that in some contexts, civil society organizations or monitoring organizations which are engaging in the larger realm of human rights and monitoring violations feel themselves being at risk because of potential risk of retaliation coming from these actors, or from the local states which actually contract these actors.
Okay.
So for our communities, there is a lot of practical tools that we need to think about in terms of equipping local civil society, equipping INGOs for better access.
Okay, thank you very much, Beatrice. Okay, we are running over time, so I'm going to have to speed us up a little bit. I'll be coming back to some more questions, but first of all, a voice from the field, as it were. Some background. Ahead of the forum back in November 2021, a field consultation was commissioned by the DG ECHO regional office in Dakar. And we have the results of some of the recommendations from that field report now. The subject was armed non-state actors and humanitarian assistance, field perspectives on why and how to engage. So to present those recommendations briefly, we have WFP Regional Dakar Humanitarian Military Interaction and Access Officer. What a title. Mr. Tidiane Fall. Tidiane, the floor is yours. He's joining us virtually, I believe. If everything goes smoothly. I don't see any panic yet over there, but perhaps shortly. Yes, he's there. Hello, Mr. Fall. Can you hear us okay? Are you on mute? Famous 4 words.
Hello?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon from Dakar. My name is Tidiane Fall. I'm working for Regional Humanitarian Interaction and Access Officer. I intervened in today's forum as a reporter of the fields that can be summarized as follows. First and foremost, addressing simple, systematic, and recurring issues should remain a priority for the UN, the European Union, and its member states. In particular, the UN humanitarian leadership in OCHA should continue to invest in safeguarding humanitarian principles and supporting the humanitarian community and its dialogue with the regular actors. Adequate capacity for long-term and continued engagement in SIMCOR, notably in terms of human resources, should be provided. Turning on SIMCOR is indispensable and a specific roster of for the timely mobilization of competent personnel. The European Union and its member states should use their diplomatic influence and advocate to our national government to ensure arms court of humanitarian actors are only used as solution of last resort. European Union forces deployed should lead by example in respecting distinction of mandate with humanitarian actors. Example by refraining from engaging on quick impact projects of humanitarian nature, like direct assistance, education, health, or at least by clearly distinguishing them from humanitarian actions. Secondly, SIMCOR can play a role of enabler for the respect of and compliance with the international humanitarian law by ensuring that protection issues are part of the civil-military dialogue, turning deliverer to armed forces, including awareness on humanitarian actions, principles and protections, and these trainings are also extended to commanding officers. They're not limited to high-ranking officers. The number of actors providing this training remains limited in order to maintain high standards and avoid forces turning toward the least demanding provider. Accountability and responsibility mechanisms centered on specific obligations are required by European Union member states to open engagement in military cooperation, particularly in relation to equipment provision. Stabilization and nexus strategy, including European Union ones, are implemented with dual-arm approach vis-à-vis the protection of civilians and the humanitarian space. Finally, enhancing civil-military coordination with other non-state actors remains key, ensuring the confliction and protection of humanitarian aid workers by promoting international humanitarian law is just as critical as with the regular armed forces. The European Union and its member states should use their diplomatic influence to ensure such a dialogue and coordination. Thank you so much. This is from ECHO Regional Office Dakar with the field process of field consultation with the relevant key partners at the ground level. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Diane Val. Thank you. And for anyone interested in actually reading that without buffering problems, you can find that on the European Humanitarian Forum website. The report is published there. Okay, we've talked a little bit about the challenges and just the needs, but I'd like to delve in a bit more detail into specific recommendations. What should the EU be prioritizing when it comes to amplifying the effect of civil-military coordination? Mr. Bueno, perhaps you could speak to that. Yeah, the working one.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Yes, it does work. One of the key, which actually Tidiane flagged, and that is sustainability and human resources, I think is absolutely critical here, where we need to have, and that's when it comes to the training, where the training is continuous. It is inclusive of all the partners. I mean, interesting enough, all the partners sitting here are actually, have been very gracious with their time, their field colleagues' time, and have participated in our trainings, actually, because they're the subject matter experts, so it's better to have them than us do it, and it's fantastic. So that's one. It's sustainability. If we're only one or two people on the ground, we can't do it ourselves as OCHA, as CIVNO, we shouldn't. So sustainability is, how do you make it sustainable? You make it sustainable by making it part of the wider humanitarian community, not their obligation, but their involvement in it. Ensuring that we do have consistent staff on the ground is another one. And then the third one is infusing the humanitarian civil-military coordination thinking, or humanitarian civil-military coordination broadly, into peace institutions, military institutions in the region. Again, if you can influence doctrine, if you can influence the way the Malian army thinks, you don't then have to automatically start from scratch when you do the trainings. It doesn't come across as new information to them. It's echoing, it's amplifying something they have already been taught. Mm-hmm. And that is, in fact, where we as OCHA are going in the future, this year into the future, and that is to, rather than us have everything, us keeping all the information to ourselves, so to speak, and holding it, and that is developing proper training packages. The Brigadier General spoke about these videos that were done, having something where we can give training packages to academic institutions, to military training institutions in the region in order for them to impart that knowledge, and us just simply refreshing that knowledge.
But you mentioned it earlier. I mean, what use is all that training unless there is also the monitoring capability as well? And that's not an EU thing. Maybe it's a member state thing, but...
No, I hear you on that one. I think this is perhaps the converse of doing a lot of training is that there need to be mechanisms in there to do the monitoring. And as I said, that is not a role that OCHA does, but absolutely, if, for example, the EU is doing a lot of training, then one would hopefully expect that they would also do the monitoring of their training. As with any programs, you develop a program, you implement a program, and then you monitor your program.
Exactly. It doesn't sound as though there's any shortage of training capacity here, and lots of innovation at ICRC as well, 3D or Oculus Rift style training sessions. But yeah, that monitoring is important as well. Dr. Durham, who should be, where do you think the EU needs to focus more in order to promote compliance?
Well, thank you, and I would like to build very much on my fellow panelists. I think it's working very well, the complementarity in action, so to speak, on the panel. Of course, there's a lot that the EU can do to ensure more respect for IHL, and one of them would really start with a full embedding of, and also a mainstreaming within foreign policy towards contexts of armed conflicts or parties to an armed conflict. I think one of the things we're very concerned about is that countries at war and belligerents cannot be on the receiving end of sort of diplomatic business as usual. How do we bring it forefront into some of the political and wider considerations, as well as building on the other issues raised? I mean, certainly what we argue is that IHL could be very much like a compass to guide the behaviour. Certainly, I think, as we mentioned before, with EU mandates and operational planning documents, to make sure, for example, in the common security and defence policy missions, there's systematic featuring of explicit objectives, not ones that you have to have hundreds of lawyers read in, but really explicitly articulated the objectives around that area.
What's holding the EU back from making those objectives explicit? Why are they not already explicit?
Well, we see a number of them, but quite often both the EU and other multilateral forums, there tends to be a need to sort of read more heavily in some of these issues. I think we're progressing in that space, but it's there. I think the issue, as you raised it very much, is the proper assessment of the intent, the capacity and the leadership of partners. As I said, we're really focusing beyond just states themselves, but the partners. And we really see that support to partners through the European peace facilities should really be framed and have concrete actions. That involves vetting. That involves the accountability. We've got a lot in the last few decades of what I would call international enforcement mechanisms, from the International Criminal Court to ad hoc tribunals. That infrastructure is there. It's how do we then do accountability. Certainly ICRC doesn't get involved in any of those prosecutions, but we do raise with parties in a conflict, as we are currently across the globe, confidentially and bilaterally, concerns about breaches of IHL, and importantly unpacking the humanitarian consequences, that these breaches aren't academic, they have an impact on millions of people's lives. So I think there's things that can be done structurally, and I think one of the things we keep urging the EU to do is fully leverage its capacity to influence in a positive way towards compliance with IHL, as well as use all the infrastructure that we have.
And Beatrice, I saw you nodding there. Leverage, the EU needs to leverage its influence. You thoroughly agree?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think maybe going one step further, I think for all of us who are working towards IHL and protection of civilians, it's the political commitment of the EU and of EU member states to prioritize the protection of civilians, to insert language in high-level forums, in political summits, in about IHL, but also IHL violations and accountability and the fight against impunity. It's extremely important, actually, because it opens a space for all of us to then work at the local level with the government, with the militaries, with the civil society on these questions. So really the political weight of the EU and EU member states is extremely important.
Yeah. By the way, I'm asking lots of questions, guys, but you're more than welcome to submit questions yourself. Please do so via Slido, and the session code to do that is EHF-RU. I don't see anyone grabbing their phones or iPads, but you can if you want to, so please consider that as well if you've got a burning question. Thank you very much, Beatrice. I think we will, first of all, before going back to you, Anthony, let's invite, let's have a couple of interventions from the floor. The first one is from Mr. Scott Fontaine from USAID. And unfortunately, we don't have so much time, but Mr. Fontaine, are you with us? Sounds almost biblical. We can hear your voice.
Am I coming through okay?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear. Go for it.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, thanks everyone for the opportunity. I will make it quick. As you can tell from my background, I am in a beautiful mid-range hotel here in southeastern Poland, where I'm currently on our Ukraine disaster assistance response team. But I want to take some time out to make sure that I can just talk about a topic that's of increasing importance to USAID. Betty Aquila knows all too well about this because I talk to him about it almost every week. Humanitarian notification systems. As many of you know, USAID has long advocated for the widespread use of these systems, and there seems to be greater attention on this topic now than there has been in recent memory. Again, Russia's unprovoked war of Ukraine, I think, just shines light on the topic of the need for notification more than ever. USAID corporately sees notifications as a critical way to safeguard humanitarians, ensure the community can reach those who need it most. It's really a vital tool that again, we like to sort of push on as much as we can. But at the same time, I think folks who have done this for a while understand that a lot of these systems can work very differently with differing levels of success in different conflicts. Look, some of this is a natural product of various armed forces and other armed groups, having just different levels of capacity and, frankly, support of IHL. Just for the panelists, and as always, I'd like to hear feedback if you have any thoughts on this. I just want to urge that, the wider sort of humanitarian community, the civil community, that we work together on refining a system that can just be activated immediately or as close to immediately as possible after the start of a conflict, and really be applicable and open to all humanitarian organizations and parties to a conflict that wish to participate. I also think we can do a better job as a humanitarian community that's spreading the word to NGOs and others about the importance of participating, which I can get into if anyone's curious, but I think we've sort of seen participation go up and down depending on sort of the contours of the conflict, but I think it's something we could do a better job sort of pressing people on. And then, for our military colleagues, just, and I know I'm talking to the U.S. Department of Defense about this, but just trying to find ways to mainstream the use of H&S into the sort of applicable doctrine or policy. I think that could be, it's really a good opportunity for everyone in the room. So that's what I got. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Scott. Next, we will hear from Action Contre la Faim, Ms. Mena Seged Abraha, who's an advocacy officer there. Mena?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can see you. Yes,
Perfect.
Great. Go ahead.
Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you also to the panelists for their insightful interventions. I would like to start by reiterating what has already been said on, the importance of civil military coordination for improving and maintaining humanitarian access for organizations like us operating on the ground. And for that, simple mechanisms and their effectiveness on the ground is extremely important, and I think that organizations like us also have a role in improving that. From the perspective of action against hunger, one key element that we find highly relevant is monitoring the practices on the ground vis-à-vis respect of IHL, as has already been pointed before. In order to detect access constraints and undertake evidence-based engagement with key stakeholders at different levels, whether local, national, or regional, etc. Beyond highlighting the inconsistencies that we need to bridge the gap between policy and practice, it is also key to showcase the humanitarian consequences they provoke in terms of field visits that we have to cancel or programs that we suspend or delays on the ground that we accumulate because, for instance, we could not accept armed escorts in certain contexts. It is important that such monitoring is further encouraged and sufficiently resourced to ensure that debates and decisions on these topics are based on evidence-based analysis. One key finding that we have from such work that we undertake points to the asymmetric relationship between military and humanitarian actors in civil-military coordination. This transpires through the quality of interactions in SimCorps, affecting fluid decision-making, fluid information sharing, also affecting, to which extent these forums can be effective, relevant mechanisms on the ground. For that, ensuring quality, regular, and high-level representation of military, but as well, organizations, humanitarian organizations, as we've also mentioned just now, is important so that we ensure that these are solution-oriented discussions. Because I think at the end of the day, what determines the effectiveness of such mechanisms is the extent to which on the ground we are able to have access and we are able to reach those in need and those in need are able to reach us. One of the positive lessons learned that we have consists of reinforcing the dialogue between military, humanitarian, and other actors on the ground, on principles, on humanitarian principles, on IHL, on our respective mandates and SimCorps mechanisms. Such examples at the local levels, focusing on the bottlenecks we collectively face and troubleshooting together specific challenges, concrete experiences are immensely beneficial. It can additionally contribute to closing the gap between these two types, between the gap that we have, the underlying factors of mutual mistrust that we sometimes see between these two types of stakeholders. It can additionally also contribute. I would just stop just here by saying that I think that such key learnings should also feed strategic and conceptual discussions at the EU capitals level and other decision-making levels involving relevant stakeholders from the aid, external action, and security spheres to ensure that these are meaningful discussions that will have an impact on the ground. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mena. Our next intervention is live, folks. We have Mr. Edouard Rodier, who is the director of the Norwegian Refugee Council.
All right, thank you. Live and standing, I was told. No, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this consultation that took place and that you mentioned from the field. I'll try to keep it very short, but I would like to take the opportunity of that intervention to liaise as well with some of the findings of from an event, a workshop, a high-level workshop I attended 2.5 years ago. That was also on civil coordination. That included force commanders from Barkhane, from MINUSMA, and the DG ECHO was also hosting. And one of the challenges that were highlighted in these consultations, but as well that were spelled out there, were specifically, and I took one of these examples because I would like to see whether we can take advantage of this panel to discuss that, but the difficulties that can be faced by civil coordination officers to be heard, to be consulted, to see their recommendations implemented. So the reason, and of course you understand how I put it like this, because senior events like the one of today, I mean, we can take stock of where we are. We can also assess the kind of progresses we've made. And I think that second part is more interesting. And if progresses were not made, or if not enough progresses were made, and let's take that example, for instance, about how do we manage, when we have SIM Quad officers, to make sure that this mechanism, these people are senior enough. And while we humanitarians understand the specific constraints and the military can have on the ground, how can we be heard? How can we be better heard? And now, look, today on the panel we are being hosted by DG ECHO. We have the representative of ES, of the military staff of the EU. Basically, we have the entire EU, right? Relevant stakeholders gathered. So why don't we look into the way for the EU to lead by example and to tell us, because you are all here, and how can we make progress on these issues? Can we take that example, very concrete example on the ground, to see how EU can lead the way? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. We will certainly do that after our final intervention. That is from the West Africa Director at Humanité et Inclusion, Mr. Julien Benoist.
Bon,
Julien,
bonjour. Oui, bonjour à tous, vous m'entendez?
Ouais, ouais.
Merci. Je vais parler dans la langue de Molière cette fois-ci. Merci à tous pour cette opportunité. Rappeler quelques points et partir de quelques exemples avec l'intégration croissante des agendas en matière de besoins humanitaires, de développement, de paix et de sécurité, une meilleure coordination civile et militaire est évidemment cruciale. En tant qu'organisation humanitaire intervenant dans plusieurs pays du Sahel, Handicap International a pu observer les différents mécanismes de coordination civilo-militaire d'un pays à l'autre. Si on prend l'exemple du Niger, la rencontre avec le chef du gouvernement nous a permis de faire avancer les discussions sur les mesures d'état d'urgence qui, initialement, sans concertation avec les acteurs humanitaires, avaient très fortement impacté la faisabilité de nos opérations. La création et la décentralisation du cadre de concertation sur les mesures d'obligation d'escorte au niveau départemental a vraiment été une bonne initiative pour réintroduire de la flexibilité dans les décisions. La SIMCORP décentralisée fonctionne bien avec un bon niveau de reporting sur l'analyse de contexte, le suivi des déplacements et les besoins humanitaires. Dans d'autres contextes dans lesquels on intervient, on a aussi constaté que la SIMCORP pouvait être en revanche entravée par certaines irrégularités des réunions, la faible implication des parties prenantes militaires, notamment en raison de la rotation fréquente au sein de la chaîne de commandement ou des problèmes de représentation appropriée des différentes composantes des forces armées. On peut citer par exemple la participation des forces aériennes comme cruciale dans certaines situations, et on le voit encore aujourd'hui avec la situation en Ukraine, tout comme la participation également des milices officiellement reconnues nous apparaît importante. Il est nécessaire de mettre en place des cadres de SIMCORP qui soient harmonisés, décentralisés à tous les niveaux et fondés sur un leadership fort avec des interlocuteurs pertinents et une capacité à aborder les sujets les plus difficiles dans un dialogue ouvert. C'est à ces conditions pour nous que la SIMCORP sera fondée sur des règles co-construites et axée sur la recherche de solutions satisfaisantes pour tous, y compris sur des questions vraiment très sensibles comme le recours aux escortes armées. Il nous apparaît également important de rappeler la nécessité de former les officiers civilo-militaires, ça a déjà été dit. À Lyon, Handicap International est engagé depuis longtemps dans la formation des officiers civilo-militaires aux principes humanitaires et aux perspectives des ONG. Ces formations ainsi que nos interactions sur le terrain ont démontré ô combien il était important que les différences de mandat et de perception soient comprises et acceptées par tous. La formation des forces armées au droit international humanitaire est une importance capitale et le CICR en est un acteur clé. il est sans cesse nécessaire de renforcer le travail de sensibilisation à l'action et aux principes humanitaires. J'aimerais partager un dernier exemple au nom d'Handicap International, une troisième expérience qui concerne la cellule de coordination humanitaire militaire mise en place à Amman en 2017, comprenant des représentants de la force opérationnelle conjointe menée par les États-Unis à la tête de la coalition militaire contre l'État islamique et du personnel d'OCHA représentant la communauté humanitaire. Nous avions alors saisi l'opportunité de cet espace de coordination pour exprimer nos graves préoccupations concernant les décès de civils signalés à la suite des opérations militaires conduites à Raqqa et demander des informations quant à l'utilisation et l'impact des armes explosives dans les zones peuplées. Bien que les réponses données à l'époque n'avaient pas été satisfaisantes pour nous, c'est l'occasion de rappeler à la coalition militaire ses responsabilités en matière d'utilisation d'armes dans les zones peuplées et pourquoi, en tant qu'humanitaires, nous attendons des comptes sur de telles questions. Des leçons peuvent être tirées de cette expérience particulière afin qu'elle puisse servir de fondement à des mécanismes de coordination civilo-militaire dans d'autres situations de conflit où OCHA peut jouer un rôle au nom de la communauté humanitaire. Je terminerai par cela, dans des contextes où les stratégies d'accès sont extrêmement complexes et volatiles, car conditionnées par la nature de l'aide, la dynamique sur le terrain et la nature des autorités en place, toute action conduisant à une confusion des mandats constitue une menace pour la sécurité de notre personnel et une difficulté supplémentaire pour l'accès humanitaire. Le dialogue continu et soutenu sur la SIMCORD, la distinction des mandats et l'engagement mutuel vers la protection des civils ainsi que le respect du droit international humanitaire reste d'une impérieuse nécessité. En atteste la situation actuelle des populations vivant dans le Sahel et notamment les plus vulnérables. Je terminerai par mettre en lumière la situation dramatique actuelle qui prévaut à Djibo, loin de l'actualité médiatique dans la région du Sahel au Burkina Faso. Cette situation souligne que le rôle d'OCHA, les moyens mis à sa disposition et son leadership sur ces questions sont essentiels pour faciliter le respect du DIH par toutes les parties. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Great, thank you very much, Julien. And he hit the nail on the head as well, talking about the need for leadership. Let's pick up on what Mr. Rodier said and Julien as well. The EU needs to show leadership. We talked a little bit earlier about the challenges and the need. Who would like to, I think, well, should we go to our opening? Okay, Anthony, first of all. How do we ensure that the experts on this stuff actually are listened to and can do their work and even more effectively?
Yeah. I think, there's many things that we can say in this regard, and that three things that we can, I think, recommend going forward. And the first is pretty simplistic and straightforward, but it is even clear when you hear all the intervention today, is that all of us, and I shouldn't say us, maybe I should say all these people who are doing an amazing work in the field, it's clear that everybody is bringing something constructive and positive and that can help making a difference on the ground. But what is really striking to me, and it's been striking in Somalia, it's been striking in the Sahel, it's been striking in many other parts where we work, is that we do not have enough coordination. It's clear that we can, and Helen was talking about complementarity, it's clear we can find complementarity. The ICRC is doing things that nobody else can do. Civic, the same, and all these organizations as well. And so, but what we do not do enough is to spend time to coordinate on the ground so that we do not overlap. And there is so much that we lose in this regard, and I think the EU should promote that.
Is the political will there to create the time? And time requires money to create that time. Political will.
I think there is. I think they should. It should come from us, organizations who work on this, and it should also come. I don't think there is a problem in sort of encourage and promote coordination. But the second thing I want to say is, from an EU perspective, we need to ensure that and this is going to increase in the next few years. We will see. There's going to be even more funding for security forces. And the Ukraine crisis is obviously, we've seen already what's happening. We need to integrate in these funding resources for security forces a percentage or something that is devoted to civil military coordination, compliance with IHL and human rights. This is absolutely critical. We cannot afford to continue having these mechanisms funded in sort of by other charity or other ways. It has to be integrated if we want to really have an impact. And then a third aspect, which is probably less forward, but I think it's really important, is to continue promoting multilateral approach to peace and security as opposed to bilateral approach. Beatrice was talking about the use of private military security forces. We have no leverage when these kind of groups are deployed in different contexts. Where we have the leverage is when there is a multilateral approach, where the Security Council is adopting a resolution and can say we are also requesting such parties to do this on compliance. And this is going to be increasingly difficult, and this is, in order to maintain that multilateral approach, we're going to have to increase partnership between the different regional organizations, meaning the UN, because we are no longer in a position to establish big peacekeeping operations with a lot of peacekeepers. It's impossible, including in counterterrorism context, with the EU and with the AU. And we cannot afford to, fight or find problems between us. We have to work between us, regional organizations, in order to create a space that is going to provide us a leverage to make a difference on this work.
Very clear. Thank you, Anthony. Before we go to the questions from Slido, Helen, you had something to add.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we've all expressed in one way or other the need for high-level political support, but also, and I think a few people mentioned it, if we want to look at how we can get these voices heard at the table, which is a critical issue. You can have all the training in the world, but if you don't get, first off, a seat at the table and then the capacity to be listened to, we've got to have more at the, also from bottom up and at I would say, a working level, better skilled and understanding about IHL, better training, better human resources in relation to people knowing the parameters so we can move beyond the siloed impact. You're right. Complementarity is important. It's incredibly important for humanitarian actors themselves to be safe. So I think we don't want to throw complementarity out with the baby out with the bathwater. I know you weren't saying that, but I think we need to find the balance between complementarity and allowing warring parties and the military to understand who's the military, who are the humanitarians, and move forward that way, which in a way touches on the question there. But I also think we need to find, as you said, better coordination together, force multiplication, as the military says, in what we need to do, but training at the right levels, and that has to be a pincer movement, so to speak. Top political articulation and the training and understanding and the resources, the human resources by the EU. If I can be really honest, it's sometimes a struggle for the EU to find the right human resources. Is that right, sir? Sorry, I should be more neutral, but I think life is too short. We need the right human resources of people trained. Then when they sit at the table, they've got more capacity to have an influence. So I think it's those two things. I wanted to add that. And also, obviously, the HR due diligence policy is something that I think is critical, for example, for ICRC to continue to play a role in that. I think this is another way that's very concrete in moving forward. So thank you for that question, because I think at the end of the day, it is making sure the right voices with the right knowledge can influence the way the infrastructure works.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's go straight to Slido. A couple of questions here. I don't know who's best to pick up on this. Maybe one of our first two opening speakers. Simply put, how, and I guess it should also be in what way, does the Ukraine change how we think about international humanitarian law? When civilians are harmed with such impunity, it seems insufficient to speak of the need for more training. Would you like to take it, Mr. Skieter? Yeah, okay, you have a microphone. Yeah.
Right. If the Ukraine war changes our way of thinking about IHL, then we were wrongly thinking about IHL. This war should not be a game changer for how we deal with IHL, human rights, protection of civilians, and so on. What it did have as an effect, and I immediately jump on what you just said, yes, we have never seen such great solidarity at the political level within the EU institutions and within the EU at the very highest level. The first decision in the EU to support the Ukrainian population and the Ukrainian armed forces as well came 5 hours after the launching of the first attack. This is, for EU, extremely fast. Extremely fast. We saw how our heads of states and governments were unified behind the idea during the summit in Versailles last weekend, or the weekend before. It's only Monday today. Yeah. So yes, we saw another kind of solidarity at the political level. And now that I have the mic, and I wrote my whole paper full, so in free speech, Belgian General can talk about 3 hours on this. But some
the room
points...
might be empty. You can keep talking.
I will be fast. Political level, policies, I think we all have it, and what we have is under constant improvement. And I do speak about what I see in the EU. I'm not responsible for everything which happens in the EU, luckily. But what is important is, or what is even more important, is what happens in the field. And that is all about people. It is all about people, but also on our level. And if I tell you that with OCHA, we have a 2-weekly meeting, and I think whatever organization you can bring in mind that is dealing with protection of civilians and so on, is in that meeting when we speak about quick impact projects, as you have mentioned. So yes, these bodies they exist and they are improving, but it is all about people. It works as good as people talk to each other and understand each other and understand each other's complementarity. Also in the field, although we very well know that the ICRC has to remain neutral, independent and so on, sometimes they are, for us, the only source of information. I will not go deeper than that, otherwise you might have a problem. Complementarity is key, and there is another very valid statement. We all want to coordinate, and coordination is important, and yes, but nobody wants to be coordinated. And it's not a joke. It is not a joke. We saw what happened in the creation of the joint force of the G5 Sahel, for example, and how we wanted to put the civilian pillar in the force, la prévôté. It was not easy, and it is still sometimes under deep discussion. So all these things are not easy, but it starts with fora like this one, where we start understanding what the other one does, and then we have to accept that there is someone else doing something similar, complementing what we do, and so on and so on. So by accepting the roles of each other, and it's strange that the military has to say it, but I do believe in it, that because there are a lot of cliches. Civilians are all peace lovers and lazy, of course, and military are all war lovers and want to kill people. That is absolutely not true. It may have been true in the Middle Ages, but I think we are far away from the Middle Ages. I will stop there because otherwise...
No, thank you very much. Beatrice, you wanted to respond.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Ukraine does change something in terms of IHL. If I may follow up on what you were saying, General. I think what it shows, and coming back to the civil-military engagement conversation, what it shows is the huge gaps that Western militaries as local militaries may have on anticipating and understanding the civilian behavior, the patterns of civilian harm, and anticipating how the civilian dimension is unfolding in the context of such an intense war fighting. And there's a lot of preparedness that's happening, since a few years within NATO, EU member states, other nations, on how to be prepared for potential great power confrontation, as was mentioned in this panel. But at the end of the day, what we see with this, what's happening, unfolding in Ukraine, is how this is reaching unprecedented levels, and how, again, anticipating the civilian component, the civilian dimension, is something that we all need to work more on. And to be able to work on this, civil-military engagement is crucial. And this is a very strategic type of conversation for the military. Discussing with civil society, with non-military actors on potential great power conflict. It has been a challenging conversation. So I think if Ukraine can change something, is opening this door to having a conversation with civil society, with the civilians, on how the civilian dimension is going to unfold in this type of
what
context.
does that look like? Because that was actually also one of the questions via Slido. How do you get civilians involved in civil-military coordination? It sounds as though, the Brigadier General, you said that you made an attempt to do that in the Sahel. So maybe you can sketch out what should that look like.
Sure. In the context of this preparedness for great power conflict, it would be rather, let's say, between civil society, international and local civil society, being called to the table for, participating to these trainings or to this tabletop exercise and bringing in their own expertise. But I think maybe your question goes beyond this. And for instance, the context of the Sahel, when mentioned several times in this type of environment, the direct engagement with communities on the ground on, in a given area of operation, the military need to understand, including from the communities, what are their protection threats, their needs, but also need to be able to engage on, after an operation, on potential incidents and ways to make amends on incidents. So this engagement can be very concrete also at the local level, based on the context.
Yeah. Is there anything you would add to that? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mr. Skieter.
Oui, thank you very much. Just maybe also to answer directly to the question and complement to Bart, there's specificity with Ukraine, which is that we cannot go on the terrain. We cannot go on the terrain in whichever way. So we have actually to coordinate and anticipate in a very different fashion to what other situations have brought to us. And here I'd like just to say that despite the relatively short time span, because of course the conflict was somehow a little bit foreseen by a number of people in intelligence, but at the same time, no one had completely integrated it. And despite those factors, there's actually been a relatively good and quick coordination in advance, at least for the side that concerns civilian protection and humanitarian support on our side of the border. And this is effectively a coordination and cooperation where we have seen civilian and military actors equally being together. Now, as we are talking about this conflict, there's a specificity also which relates to one of the elements we were mentioning, Beatrice. It's the importance of the narrative around that issue. And we can see here, maybe for quite unique case, an extremely powerful counter-narrative to our own principles and approaches. And there's a lot of disinformation going around. There's a lot of creation of different realities in terms of the blame. And so you can see different actors that are claiming for themselves a certain high ground, whereas at the same time the realities on the ground are completely different and unrelated. And that actually is going to be a challenge on how we think about that in terms of the implication that this will have. At this point in time, I would say we probably are still a little bit early in anticipating on the aftermath, but we're starting on our side to have effectively some actions that are also going in the direction of identifying accountability for the following steps. We are at the moment developing a number of tools to start documenting what's happening on the ground and to be able to effectively have a stronger reaction later on. And the scale of the challenge, of course, is very tremendous. And this is effectively is going to be certainly very challenging for all actors, wherever they are. And then we will need a very, very strong coordination. Okay. Then it's just 1 minute left, so I had super simplistic elements to bring on other factors of our conversation. But of course, to indicate that when we speak of civilo-military cooperation, we can also see it from different angles. I mean, I would say for us, for Bart and myself, we are within the EU and we are coordinating in a certain way. A lot of the comments were here also about the coordination with the local military actors, which obviously is a very different type of challenge and necessitates a very different type of approach. And here, I think there were a lot of very interesting comments that were made about how we can have a lasting effect. Is training a sufficiently lasting effect? How would you keep it sustainable? Maybe it was also one of the points we were mentioning. And that calls effectively for quite a reflection on how we make that.
We are trying to put in place a few tools, and I just want to highlight in the room Tina, who's working in my team, and is working very strongly on finding out effectively what are these kinds of tools that we can have, notably through our CSDP mission for a stronger integration of those factors and having a stronger work with local actors to effectively keep that sustainability in the future. But this is still perhaps to a certain extent a bit of a burgeoning factor, despite all the goodwill that we can be showing, and thank you very much for all the comments that were made before.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Mr. Bouhene, we're the last session, so go on.
We can keep on going. Excellent.
Yeah. And I'd like to put one final question to you as well. Oh, sorry.
I actually
okay.
just wanted to talk about the last question that was asked, because I think it's a very important question about the, it says we have not heard about the risk for humanitarians when the limit between humanitarian and military operations is blurred. And I wanted to, particularly if you look in the Ukraine right now, that is a key question, and that's a key question that's on our agenda, and it's a lot about distinction. How do we make sure that the Russian military, that the Ukrainian military, and frankly that NATO understands that we're on the ground and that we can't be using the same roads, we can't be using the same airports, we can't be using the same facilities, and also the language that the EU uses, that the Americans use in terms of conflating humanitarian with military or security operations needs to be divorced, right? The narrative is within the media already. There's a confusion of language. And so we work heavily with the partners through our communications team, but also we have people on the ground in the Ukraine who pick this up, right? The humanitarian community tell us, by the way, such and such NGO is using the military to transport their equipment. So when we were talking about, and the woman from ACF was correct, right? We talk about monitoring. That's monitoring that we do as a community, and then we feed it up in trying to make changes that way, not publicly. So when I was talking about monitoring and compliance, it's not about bringing somebody to court, but making sure that we understand what is happening, and when we find something out, that we talk to the right entities to do so.
And are they listening?
The military.
Are those entities listening? And
absolutely. Certainly, I mean, the long-standing relationship with NATO, for example, is much easier. Again, back to training, back to dialogue, back to engagement over the last 20 years. Sitting down with them to talk about distinction is much, much easier than sitting down with, say, the Russian forces or any other force, the Malian force. It doesn't really matter. Those who are not commonly engaged with us on a regular basis over a long period of time, it takes longer. But the principles are there. IHL is there. They understand the principles. They just need to figure out how to operationalize those principles. And that's what, in many ways, humanitarian civil-military coordination is all about. It's making sure that the humanitarian community has a voice to the military has a voice to the humanitarian community, so that we can coordinate or collaborate, depending on the environment, in order to reduce civilian harm.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much, Mr. Bouhene. And again, another key word there for this session, I think operationalizing the way we think about civil-military coordination, that needs to happen. A couple of other key takeaways from me. I love what you said, Anthony, about that there is an opportunity now, and we need to make sure going forward that real money is set aside as part of security budgets and it goes towards civil-military coordination. Multilateral approach, also key. So it's clear that, at least in this room, I think there is definitely a will, and where there's a will, there is a way. So let's leave on that positive note. Thank you very much, everybody, for your questions and attendance.